I graduated in 2019. I had to think about it, and this is my third year teaching. Okay, so my partner teacher had been teaching for, at the time, about 14 years, and she suggested, hey, Shelby, let's go home visit all of our kids. And I was like, oh, you're crazy, like, that's 50, like, we have 50 kids between the two of us. And I got to thinking about it, and I remember kind of, what you and some other teachers had talked about, and I was like, all right, let's do it. So about 3-4 weeks before school started, we started that transition into trying to make like 10 home visits a day. Like, we just picked out a day, and we would just try to find some kids that lived close to each other, and it was really eye-opening. I teach in an area that I grew up in, and you would think that I would know every street and every nook and cranny of those streets, but stopping and really taking the time to get to know where each student lived, you find places that you overlook. And so one cool thing was most of them didn't know we were coming, and so we kind of caught them off guard, which some of them are like, my teacher is here, my teachers are here to see me in the summer, but it was just, it showed you kind of what you have in your classroom. So from, I saw the poorest of the poor to the richest of the rich, and it just kind of gave you a insight like, hey, okay, like, this is what I got going on in my room. But it definitely helped start the year on a positive note and start that first real form of positive communication with families, to let them know, hey, I care enough about you to give up some time of my summer to come see you and meet you. And so that was one encouraging thing from it. Yeah, so I teach 5th grade, math and science, and we have a mix and meet day where at the time, my first year, our building was 5-6, and so new 5th graders would come in and they could have lunch with their teachers and get to know the building and figure out where all their classes were. And so we took a little almost like postcard type thing that introduced mix and meet and a little bit about myself and my partner teacher, and just kind of encouraging them to come to that so they could see the school before the first day. So some families were like, wanted us to almost like eat dinner with them or like move in with them. Like, you can just tell they were very welcoming. And but some of them, we just stayed on the porch for a couple different reasons. Some of it was safety. Like, you see the real that students live in, and it'll sometimes break your heart. And so with those families, you just didn't really want to go in the house, but you wanted to show like, hey, I'm not judging you, I'm here, I want to get to know your kid, but in your head you're like, probably shouldn't go in that house. So there were several houses, one house in particular. I had started to walk up this huge sidewalk, and it was in a really like sketchy part of town. Like, I've been familiar with it. I don't go there on purpose. And walking up, I stepped over a machete to walk into this student's front porch that was like not really a front porch, and the door was almost like a bedding sheet. And it was like, how do I knock? So I was like, I just like knocked on the siding of the house, and you see that, and then the student comes out, and there's a little bit of, you can tell a little bit of embarrassment, like, oh gosh, my teachers are here, to see me. But it was one of those where my partner teacher and I are great about really trying to just notice the child and see it for the child. But that house in particular really stood out. And so to transfer that into the year, that student was a lot of chaos, had a lot going on with it. And you think back, even in those moments of like your biggest frustration, you're like, why can't you bring back that form? Like, I've sent you 6, like, why aren't you bringing it? And then you think, well, okay, remember how their house looked? It was a a house of chaos. So let's have some grace there. Let's teach them responsibility and let's teach them organization, but let's also, like, this is where they live, this is where they grow up, and so it was good to bounce back to that. And there were several houses that was a thing with my partner teacher and myself. Also, on the flip side of that, you go to the houses and you can tell the kid has everything they could want and then some, and that also is another context that really played out in the classroom. That kid that complains when they don't get their way, or when they're not the center of attention, you think back to, okay, well, they grew up in an environment where they were like they were the main focus, and so they're having to share attention with another class full of students, and so that also, on the flip side, played into it. My first year in March is when the world shut down, and so the last 2 years over the summer we have not gone to their homes, but we have made contact, like actual, they finally picked up the phone contact, and I think it's not as powerful as going to their homes, but it definitely still gets you started on the right note, and it does, it takes a lot of time, and not as much time to make the phone calls, but it's kind of nerve-wracking, like for me, because I'm not naturally extroverted, and so but I can just see the benefit of doing that these last 2 years. So last year I did that, and then this year we did the same. Yeah, I just think, last year it was really frowned upon. And we asked our principal, we said, hey, how do you feel about it this year? And he was like, just use your best judgment. And so I didn't want parents I didn't know how they would feel about it, so we just kind of did it on the phone. But, if all goes well, this next summer, we plan on doing it again. It's more personal, and they see you, and they see, like, on the phone they just hear you and they make an impression of you from what they hear, but when you're in person, like, they see, okay, this is actually a human being, like, and they smile and they're not scary and all those things. So yeah, so I know in class you had always talked about making a positive contact before you have to make a negative. And so when you home visit or when you phone call, that's a positive for every student. You don't even know them yet. You just introduce yourself and you're on the right track. And so then from there, that first week of school when you call home, it's usually another positive. And then from there, that's sometimes when the more negative phone calls can arise. But the joke my first year teaching with my partner teacher and I is we would be like, don't make us come to your house. Like, we know where you live, And they'd be like, oh, yeah, she's right. Like, she knows where I live. So it helped, and I think the parents appreciated us more and saw our hearts more. Like I said, kind of like we're humans. We're not just, because I think sometimes the public thinks teachers are these perfect people that are up on a pedestal and maybe are quick to judge parents or kids, and that's definitely not the case when you show up in normal clothes and introduce yourself, or it's morning time over the summer and you make a phone call to their house. It's more personal and they get to know you. Yeah, so that's always a struggle, even like the beginning of the year when you send those forms home that they have to send back. But just being persistent and like going through every number, like finding a sibling and like emailing them, like the sibling through like Tiger Mail or through our email at school, and then being like, hey, what's a number I can call that will work? My mom is a teacher, and I didn't really have a choice of not having someone involved in school. And so that was definitely my first year. Shocking just how many parents aren't always super involved. So that's where you almost feel like you're the parent too. And so just really trying to make those connections with the parents, even if they're not really interested in school, I've found to be beneficial. I think sometimes education wasn't very important to them growing up, so like maybe they didn't have parents that were involved. Um, I teach fifth grade, and I've had some families who've told me that, they didn't continue school past third grade, or they didn't go past middle school, and so education for them wasn't necessarily important. Or you find the flip side of that, where parents are just working really, really hard, long hours, and they can't be as involved as they'd like to because, they have to work shifts where their kid is home and they're not. And so I think there's multiple reasons. Yeah, so relationships, building relationships with your students. When they see you as someone they can talk to and relate to, they're going to open up way more about what they deal with at home or outside of school. And with that, though, like a little spoiler, if you do that, be prepared to really have your heart impacted by that student. When you break down that wall yourself and get to know them, like they're going to impact you, and they're going to have, you're going to have such more meaningful relationships, but connections in the classroom and building a classroom environment when you have that. So. I love teaching fifth grade because they still want to be like loved and loved on, but they also want some independence, and then sometimes they fail miserably with independence, and then you have to come and help them. And I also love, like you said, that they're a little bit more ornery and a little bit more sassy, and I kind of am as well, so I can dish it right back to them. I mean, that kind of builds a classroom environment because you kind of get to banter with each other. I learned that there is more paperwork the first month of school than maybe my whole K-12 experience I remember having myself. So being organized is one thing I learned, which is not something I'm great at, so forcing yourself to be organized. I also learned that kids will zap every ounce of energy you think you have. So I feel like I'm a high energy person, but at 3:30 you crash every day. That first week of my first year, I think I went to bed every night at like 7. I always made fun of my mom growing up because that first week she would be like, "Oh man, I'm so tired." I'd be like, "Come on, Mom, like it's fine." No, you'll be so tired. You'll drink a lot of coffee and say a lot of prayers. So for strength. I also learned that just how different and special it is when it's your own classroom. You go through school and you have classes you volunteer in, or you have classes you might sub in, or you have observation hours, and you get to know the kids. But when you're in charge and that door shuts the first day and the bell rings and you're like, "Oh man, there is nobody here telling me what to do but me. Like I'm calling the shots." You're just like, "Whoa, all right, well here we go." And from there, you get to build the environment you want to have alongside with them. It's a lot. It's fun. I love it. I feel like each year I gain more confidence and more, I don't know the right word for it, but more love for it, even though it's crazy. And my first 3 years of teaching haven't been a typical first 3. It's still, there's nothing else I'd want to do, even though it's chaotic sometimes. it provides a very different context, you know, kind of like I was saying earlier when you asked me about why do you think some parents aren't as involved. I've got some students in my class whose parents do work 12-hour shifts from maybe it's 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. or 3 to 3. I know that's a big one that I have in my classroom, and so kids will be like, hey, there's no one at home to really sign these forms. It's also different because you have to be very intentional with how you teach, and that was something that I had to learn. Because for me, I don't necessarily have those same language struggles that my students do, but my homeroom class, I think I have 15 out of 25 EL students that are receiving services, so they're not tested out EL students. I think they're on emerging, like on the access score, which is what we give, and you just have to use a lot of visuals when you teach, and have to be really intentional about vocab, which it's funny, like I've learned what you do for an EL student is just good teaching for any student, but you don't really grasp that until you're in it, and so being a good EL teacher is really just being a good teacher, being specific in what you're teaching and giving them clues and instructions and pictures and very specific guidelines on things, and that helps them grow. A funny story. We were doing a test that we do a program that's on the computer that's based on their level wherever they're at. And so I teach math, and one of the questions was about a combine. And one of my students raised his hand and he was like, "What is a combine?" Like he had just never heard of it. And that shocked me because I grew up on a farm. So I knew a combine's just a really big tractor. And he was like, "I've never seen one of these." So just understanding that what they know, even if they may have, this massive language barrier, they still know stuff. You just have to figure out where are they missing, what pieces can you help fit in. So my second year teaching, I had 4 newcomers in class. And so they were basically just crossed the border, hadn't been here. I think it was one of them was here within 6 months and the others were within a month. So they were very recent to our country, and they were incredibly gifted in math. Because math is kind of a universal language. If you can do the 4 operations in any language, you may not understand word problems or exactly what the instructions are asking you. And so that was eye-opening to see they are basically on grade level, 5th grade in math. They're maybe on pre-K and kindergarten, but it's because they don't know English. And it's also cool too if a student goes to school in another country and like Spanish. That's mostly what I have in my classroom is they spoke Spanish first or are involved with Spanish. And those students that attend school in Spanish and are pretty proficient with Spanish pick up English so much faster. And so that's been really cool to see. And then on the flip side, students who are not proficient in Spanish first also have a hard time becoming proficient in English. So it's just they're trying to learn 2 different languages. I guess before I became a teacher in the district I'm in, I just assumed they're EL learner, they're proficient in Spanish, they've got it, they know, and that's a really wrong assumption, because they might speak it at home and try to speak English at school, but they're really broken in both, and they don't really have a grasp of either. And so reading and writing in English and then trying to speak in Spanish at home or read what mom and dad say at home and then they're just even more confused. So that's been an area too of struggle in my classroom. I have a couple students that over the years, in 5th grade, they can take that seal of biliteracy, and I've had 4 students that have gotten that. And one thing, when you go to parent-teacher conferences, sometimes you ask them hey, what's spoken at home? And this one kid I'm thinking about in particular, his mom was very we read and we talk and we write in Spanish at home, but we also make him do it in English. And you could tell he was very proficient in both, and he's going to go far.
Yeah.